As we get closer to the spring football game, I want to talk to you about who's the biggest X factor for this Georgia Tech offense heading into the 2023 season. It's never too early to talk about it. On this episode of Swarm Talk, brought to you by the Crowded Booth.
Pile in here and make yourself feel at home. The Crowded Booth is coming on. The Crowded Booth with Bryce Koon.
Happy Wednesday, everybody. It is a fantastic March Wednesday, the final week in March, as we get ready to turn the calendar to April, which means the spring game is only 2 weeks away for the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. My name is Bryce Koon. This is Swarm Talk. If this is your first time tuning in, make sure to hit subscribe. It's the best internet show about Georgia Tech on the interwebs on YouTube. I'm Bryce Koon. And behind me, literally in the behind the scenes, is Ralph Leary, the famed Ralph Leary, who Ralph got flamed towards the end of my tenure on the Georgia Tech beat as some rando, and Ralph ended up, it was hilarious. It was on some message boards. So, anyways, neither here nor there. It's good to be back. Good to be talking about Georgia Tech. And I got a topic for you today that I really want to talk about. Ralph's got some stats over in the private chat for me that we're going to talk about today. And where this team has to go. What is the identity? It's something that Buster Faulkner, new offensive coordinator, has already talked about. Brent Key has talked about. And you're going to start to see, obviously, more of the practices and the practice footage and, obviously, the interviews come out as well and articles everywhere about it. But it's why I think that Georgia Tech's offense has to be the X factor heading into 2023. The biggest. Let's go, Ralph, let's do this. Let's make some banners, and I want you to write it out as I say it. Number one, the defense. I don't expect the defense to be as good in 2023. Ralph, you can put that however you want that on there. And here's why. You're losing a lot. And when I say the defense, yes, Ralph put defense bad. When I say defense is not going to be as good for Georgia Tech in 2023, I mean I need to see some things from the front seven. They're going to generate a pass rush. You're losing a guy in Keon White that, in my opinion, and what we've seen, is a guy that's going to be a potentially day 2 or day 3 draft pick. Look, he is a freak athlete. He's a guy that on a lot of big boards could be taken off in the second round. That's Keon White out of Georgia Tech, who did really good testing-wise. I don't feel like the defense is going to be quite as good. They've got to get a pass rush. You're replacing a lot of experience at linebacker. Now, you obviously brought in some guys that you feel good about in Andre White, the transfer out of Texas A&M, and Braylon Oliver. But can they make the jump the same way that we saw out of Ace Ely and Charlie Thomas? Can they make that ascent this quickly into their Georgia Tech careers? That's a question mark for me. I don't know. You look at the back end. LaMiles Brooks, probably one of the, I would say, more underrated players in the ACC that we see out of this group. Brooks is a star. He's a star in the making. He's a really good football player. I also like the fact about that Ralph is just throwing some different things over in the chat, and it's making me laugh, but it's good. You have Clayton Powell-Lee, a freshman star that was really, really good last year for Georgia Tech. He's going to obviously mature. The cornerback room, what do you see here that makes you feel comfortable? You have Kenan Johnson, you have Kenyatta Watson II, you have Miles Sims, but Zamari Walton transfers out at a weird time. He goes to Ole Miss. The Rebels needed some cornerbacks, and they came calling with a nice NIL package for him. You have KJ Wallace in that nickelback slot. You still have Amari Harvey. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the back end of this defense, can they shoulder the load? Because, look, one of my biggest things is, yes, you can have an All-American back end of your defense, but if that front seven doesn't give you an adequate enough pass rush, you can't ask the secondary to guard for as long as they would have to without a legitimate pass rush. So if the pass rush is not there, I have concerns about the defense. And I also talked about the fact that the two linebacker positions, some question marks until we see it, and we're not going to know until that opening weekend game in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium against Louisville, if these guys can replicate the production seen out of Ace Ely and Charlie Thomas. Now, moving on from that, point number 2 is that I think that Buster Faulkner was the biggest get of the offseason. I think Buster Faulkner is the X factor for Georgia Tech in 2023 because you have to find a way to get your playmakers the football. And Faulkner talked in one of his media availabilities earlier this spring. He said, exactly, he said, look, what did we do at Georgia that worked? And we got our playmakers the football. It wasn't the fact that, Georgia didn't have fantastic wide receivers. Look, we're not going to talk a long time about Georgia. But they had an elite tight end. We all know about it. We've all seen it, everything. They got him the football. He game planned to the roster's strengths. And that's something that I think we can all say. We've seen a lack of that after the last 8 games when obviously Brent Key kind of took over. But going back into it, we haven't seen a lot of game planning to the strengths of this football team. It's been the square peg into the round hole. It's we want to run this offense, but we may not have the personnel. Now, while Georgia Tech brought in some fantastic personnel, and I want to go over a couple of names, it's a rebuilt wide receiver room. You have Chase Lane out of Texas A&M. You have the FCS transfer in Abdul Janae, who put up monster numbers. I want to see if Ralph can get me those numbers. Abdul Janae, the Georgia Tech transfer coming in from the FCS level. And then you have the Alabama transfer in Christian Leary, who in a loaded wide receiver room just never found consistent playing time. Leary had a fantastic 40 time. He's a burner down the field. He can take the top off of a defense, so you have some weapons. In the tight end room, you bring in one of Buster Faulkner's guys from Athens in Brett Seether. Now, Seether wasn't necessarily going to see the field at Georgia, but it wasn't because of lack of talent. It's because they're loaded in the tight end room still with the exit of Darnell Washington. But Seether brings a guy who knows what Buster Faulkner wants to do as a tight end. Now, I don't necessarily believe or know if this guy's going to turn into a all-ACC tight end, but I think the familiarity of knowing how Faulkner wants to work with tight ends helps, and it also helps that you brought in a guy in Dylan Leonard who I think can learn and grow from a guy like Faulkner that's going to want to coach these tight ends up and want to play a role with them. You also have Jackson Long, the transfer that came in from USF as well. So you're starting to build that as well. Going back to Abdul Janae, 43 catches, 579 yards, and 9 touchdowns. Now, look, you lost some things in this room for Georgia Tech, but I think they did a good job replenishing it. But why I think Buster Faulkner is the X factor is because you're going to have to overcome what we talked about in the first point, is that I don't know if Georgia Tech is going to be able to go out and hold teams to what they did at certain times last year of 10, 14, 17, 20 points a game and be able to get away with that. I think that they're going to have to, and we saw this, some of the games they lost close. The game against Virginia, which was the worst football game that anyone's ever watched in their entire life. The game against Virginia Tech, where they would like to have put more points up on the board. The game against Florida State, where the offense never really could get going. In these games, and obviously they won a couple of those, in these games, your offense needed the explosive play. They needed the consistency of just moving the chains. And I think Buster Faulkner is going to bring that by working to the strengths. It's a good running back room. Dante Smith returns. You have Trey Cooley, the junior transfer from Louisville. You have Jamie Felix, who shined. You have, obviously, a good stable of running backs to go through. So, for me, Buster Faulkner, if he can find consistency, just find a way to, I think, make this offense just have an identity, and I think he will. Identifying who your go-to guys in the month of March and April is going to help when you get into summer. These guys get to work together on their own, and then you break for fall camp. When you get to that point, there should be an identification of these are some of the guys that we can go to. Here are some of the guys that we can look at and say, this is going to be a favorite target for whoever plays quarterback. And I also want to mention that as well. Faulkner playing a big role with everyone's favorite quarterback in Atlanta. That was a joke. It's okay. Calm down. You have 2 quarterbacks in Haynes King and Zach Pyron, and let's don't forget about Zach Gibson. You have 3 guys that all have had starting experience. And in this situation, look, Haynes King, his play style reminds me a lot of what Georgia just won with the past 2 years. Zach Pyron has the grip. He has the determination. He has the it factor that we saw at times last year. I think they're going to be in good hands, and they're going to be better off with Buster Faulkner in the mix. I truly do. So as a whole, if this offensive line can be consistent, they're going to have to overcome, in my opinion, a not as a great of defense early on in the season to be able to win some football games. I think they can do it, But time will tell if Buster Faulkner is indeed the guy to do that. I think this is the biggest offseason pickup for Georgia Tech in the sense they got a guy who wins, who's creative, who obviously had a hand in an explosive offense, and he's not there anymore. We don't have to talk about, coming from Athens and anything. He's obviously wants to be at Georgia Tech. He said that. He said, look, this is an opportunity to go work with a guy that I respect, and talking about Brent Key. They had kept tabs on one another. So this is something that speaks to him getting a shot as an OC to really give an offense an identity that really hasn't had one over the past 4 to 5 years. It's been plug and play. It's finding pieces of the puzzle. Where do we go from here? But I really like the addition of Buster Faulkner. I think he's going to give him an identity, and he's going to find guys. We talked about Chase Lane, Abdul Janae, and Christian Leary. But let's don't forget about Leo Blackburn. Let's don't forget about Malik Rutherford, James Blackstrain. Obviously, a guy in DJ Moore that I'm really excited to see how he fares on the flats. There's a lot of really good options for them to go to. March and April is the time to identify who's in the lead early on. Then you come back for fall camp, and by the end of fall camp, you say, hey, these are our guys, and Faulkner's going to have that game plan of how to get the best athletes to football and create it. Because I want to shout out a guy named John Freeman who has said, what are the makings of a good offensive coordinator? It's a guy that can do a lot with a little. It's a guy that can, when a guy's not open, he can scheme them open. And I think Buster Faulkner has the potential to be that guy for Georgia Tech and taking them out of the mid to low tier of the ACC and vaulting them into that kind of top 6 of the ACC. It's going to be interesting. The ACC's got to get better. We're going to be doing a show later on in the week and into next week about the ACC and why Georgia Tech could be a part of the ACC's turnaround. But Buster Faulkner, a big hire in Atlanta. We're going to be talking, obviously, more about this as the spring goes on in the spring game, previewing that, things we want to see. But let us know down below. What do you think is the biggest X factor for Georgia Tech in 2023? My call is Buster Faulkner. I think it's the best pickup, and I think he's going to give this offense an identity that hasn't had one since the days of Coach Paul Johnson. My name is Bryce Koon. This is Swarm Talk. Before we go, I want you to subscribe. I want you to hit that subscribe button. If you're listening on podcast, get to the YouTube page. Click the link down in the podcast information. Get to the YouTube page. Get us to 2,000 subscribers, and we're going to be doing a giveaway. We got some Braves tickets, but we've also got a Georgia Tech football jersey that we're going to be giving away to a lucky fan. Make sure to do that and more. We will see you on thecrowdedbooth.com. We'll see you on social media. And until next time, my name is Bryce Koon. This has been an episode of Swarm Talk.